Hello wonderful people, it is Genevieve, and in this video we're going to draw some watercolor roses in Procreate. And I'm going to include both free brush options as well as watercolor brushes that are going to really help you achieve this watercolor feel. These roses look really good alone as well. You don't have to draw a full-on bouquet, you can just draw one little rose. So anyway, the first thing to do is to create a new canvas. And these are the dimensions that I'm using just because I'm using the pre-textured file that has like watercolor textures and effect in it, and that comes with the brushes that we'll be using later as well. So if you want to check it out, it would all be linked in the description below along with a promo code just for you guys. And I will also link in the description below a free color palette that you can download if you don't want to have you pick your own colors. So this really simple roses color palette is going to be in the description below, as well as the brushes and the pre-textured file. You can always use this hard brush that comes with Procreate and lower the opacity. It's not necessarily going to give you watercolor textures, but you're at least going to get the overlay effect that is kind of a traditional of watercolor. If you are using my ultimate watercolor brushes, go ahead and select the Dark Edges watercolor. And we're going to create a new layer that we're going to rename to Rose. I'm always struggling with this kind of writing renaming technique, but still, we got there. And you're going to pick a bright pinkish red type of color. And we're going to start by just drawing the center part of the rose. So we're going to draw these three rounded triangles that connect together and create some sort of a circle in the center. And around the center part, you're just going to build your rose by adding layers of 2 or 3 petals, like groups or 2 or 3 petals that are on the same layer. And what I mean by that, as you can see here, I'm kind of drawing these 3 petals that are almost the same size and cover the entire circumference of the center. And then I'm going around these 3 new petals and I'm going to draw 2 or 3 more petals that are getting it a little bit more big, a little bit scragglier, and I also cover the entire circumference of that circle. And then around this other layer, I'm creating a new layer of slightly bigger petal that again are going to be a bit more wiggly, a bit more wrinkly. So you get the pattern. Honestly, you're just building your flower this way and it's super easy. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about how they overlay, because you can see here I'm getting some petals that touch each other and get darker in some areas, some that don't. So at this point, you really don't have to worry about that at all. All you need is to worry about all you have to is to think about how you want your basic shape to look like. So you're kind of drawing this silhouette of a rose, and you want to still make sure that you see a difference between the different petals. Like you don't want to draw just like one big circle and call it a day, you know? But yeah, you don't have to worry too much about the actual details. Right now, all you're doing is you're drawing the silhouette of your rose, or like the base of your rose, you can call it that way. And I've also filmed another tutorial about how to draw a rose as seen from the side, because this is a scene from the top, obviously, which is a bit more easy. If you want to learn how to draw it from the side, I will link this other tutorial in the description below as well. Once you do have a base that you like, we're actually going to start adding some shadows and making it feel a bit more interesting. So to do that, if you have the ultimate watercolor brushes, go ahead and select the color shifting blotches. Otherwise, you can just stay with the brush that you've been using beforehand. And with the same red, all you're going to do is create some sort of a gradient that starts from the center part towards the outside. So on every petal, you're going to draw, like add darker or layer color basically, so it is darker towards the center of the rose and gets lighter towards the outside of the rose. And that's going to help adding some shadows, and it's also going to help blending these weird overlays that you might have created. And it's also going to help creating this watercolor texture, because you know watercolor tends to have sections that are darker, sections that are lighter, and yeah, it's this really organic feel. So by drawing these splotches and sections of colors that are darker, it's going to really help, again, create some shadows, blending your overlay edges, and create a watercolor effect. but you don't want to be too precise about this. You want to go fairly quickly, especially if you are using the color shifting brushes. It's a fairly big and soft brush, so you're not going to be able to get too many details, and that's not the point here at all. The point here is to add some shadows, some textures all over your rose in just like a minute or two. Once you have your basic shadows built, we're actually going to add some lights. So select your eraser and set it to either color shifting brushes or this hard brush or soft brush from Procreate. I'm going to be using the color shifting brushes, and all you're doing is you're just kind of erasing the outside edges of your petals. So again, that's going to help adding some light and also just help the overall watercolor feel, because again, we want to have some splotches of colors that are kind of random that mimic what real watercolor would be doing. And just like when we created a shadow, you don't want to spend too much time on this step. You just want to roughly go over your entire rose. It should not take much more than a minute or two, and even then, that might be a little bit longer. So challenge yourself to be super loose. We're drawing something that is organic and that is also like made out of watercolor in theory. So these are two things that would kind of come together to create something super flowy and loose. So make sure that you don't spend too much time. I mean, that's good, isn't it? But loose and flowy doesn't mean we're not going to take care of the little details like these ones. So we're going to use either the smudge tool or the water blender that comes with the watercolor brushes. And we're going to very gently and carefully blend in those leftover overlay edges that look a bit too digital. It's not that they look bad, it's that they really look like they were made on an iPad or on a computer, and that's not the look we're going for here. We want something that feels a bit more natural and traditional. So just go over your edges where you feel like they look too digital and blend them in, and that's going to make a big difference, believe me. So at this point, we really did the hardest part of the tutorial. We're just going to add more details and more texture to make everything pop a little bit more. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some color variation, because right now it looks a little bit flat and watercolor tends to have a lot of pigments that blend together. The way to do it is you're going to select the selection tool, set it to freehand, and you're going to draw any random wobbly shape on top of your rose, and then you're going to feather the selection around 30 to 40%. And using hue, saturation, and brightness in the adjustment panel, you're going to shift the hue towards whichever side you want. You can make your rose a little bit more pink or a little bit more orange. And you're also going to play with the brightness and maybe even the saturation. So basically all you want to do right now is to change up the color a little bit in some areas, just so it's more interesting in the end. The way you do that is up to you. That's really your decision and how you want your rose to look like. And you can see here, it's a very simple step, but it makes a big difference. We're gonna use a similar technique. So again, the selection tool set to freehand, but this time we're gonna draw a circle that kind of select the center part of your rose, and then you're gonna select and click on this little gray dot that's going to help you close your selection. You can see everything that is kind of in this diagonal pattern is what is not selected. You're going to want to invert your selections. You can see now the center is the part that is not selected. You're then going to feather your selection again around 30%. And what that does is basically what you have selected now is only the outside part of your rose. You're then going to go back to hue, saturation, and brightness, and you're going to up the brightness. And you can see now your rose is really going to come to life. The center part is going to be darker and the edges are going to be lighter. You can even lower the saturation, and yeah, it just looks so much better, and that took 2.5 seconds to do. Maybe 3. You might also want to make your piece a little bit more crisp and detailed. If that's the case, go ahead and create a new layer that you're going to rename to lines or details, whatever you prefer. And you're going to change the blending mode of this one to color burn, linear burn, or multiply. You're then going to select the coloring pencil or like the HB pencil from the sketching menu in Procreate. And with your same pink red that you've been using, you're going to outline the petals and maybe add these little like shadows that are more crisp just because you are using like a sketching pencil instead of this really loose painterly brush. You can then use either the water blender or the smudge tool to blend in your strokes if they look a little bit too scribbly, but you do want to make sure that the actual edge of the petal still is like super crisp, because that's the goal of this layer basically. And yeah, you can definitely play along and play around, and select a blending mode that you like, and that just adds a lot of depth and details to your piece. So I'm obviously not going to draw all of it because that would take a long time. That's like a more time intensive step, but that's basically the same technique that you would draw all over your rose. You can also choose to add some splatters, so creating a new layer, setting the blending mode to linear burn, and then selecting the splatter brush that comes with the watercolor brushes. And with your same pink or red, you just add some splatters. And that's a really cool final touch for like a watercolor effect, but it is definitely optional. Another thing you can do is to add some leaves. So creating another layer and renaming it to, you guessed it, leaves. And selecting a nice green color. And you would just pick the same brush that you used to draw your rose. So in my case, the dark edges watercolor. And the thing with roses is the leaves usually come in groups of like 3 when they are like not an actual like rose bush, when they're just on like one rose stem, whatever it's called. And the leaves are quite round in the base, and then they get super pointy. So they're really typical shape of leaves, but yeah, they come in groups of 3. So what you can do is just draw like one little stem with a leaf on the top and then 2 leaves on the side. And that's going to be very typical of what you would find for roses. You can add a few different like leaf groups and even draw single leaves in some areas. So you can definitely surround your rose and make it feel more interesting if you're not drawing a whole bouquet. By just adding a few leaves here and there, it's going to make a big difference, and it's also going to be more interesting in terms of the color because you're going to get some complementary color action going on in there. You can also go back with your water blender or the smudge tool to blending the overlay edges. You don't want to necessarily go back with your color shifting brushes and add more like depth and details to these leaves, because otherwise they're going to steal the show away from the rose, which should be like the main focal point of your piece. And you can also blend in kind of the end of either the stem or the leaf that is actually connecting with the rose to kind of mimic this idea that maybe the pigments that are green and that are pink are blending in together like they were still wet, basically. So yeah, play around, try some things, and you can definitely draw more roses. You can draw a whole bouquet just with the same technique, and adding in these darker edges with the pencil, as you can see, makes a big difference in terms of making everything pop. It is optional, but I definitely recommend taking the time to do it. And I would love to see the roses that you guys create, so make sure to share the results with me either on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And also don't forget to give this tutorial a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, because it really does help the channel. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe because I put out new ones every single week. And with that said, I will see you soon.